Okay, well, welcome everyone to History Matters and So Does Coffee. You know, every week I think to myself as I do this, wow, does coffee matter this week? And yet it's just another week with coffee. At any rate, before we begin, there is another face here that I would like to introduce, and that is Jessica Ellison, who has just taken over as leadership of National Council for History Education, NCHE. And Jessica, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the amazing History Matters community?
Yes. Hello. Good morning, everyone. I am Jessica Ellison, and I am calling in from White Bear Lake, Minnesota, on the ancestral land of the Mdewakanton Dakota. And up until early December, I was a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society, where I worked for 18 years. And I am thrilled to be the new executive director of the National Council for History Education. History is where my heart is. My parents will tell you all kinds of stories about going places as a child and them not understanding why I needed to stand in the middle of Gettysburg and just absorb the space. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I love history educators, and I can't wait to further connect with all of you.
Well, welcome. We're very happy to have you here, and nice to unofficially meet you, but still really nice. Today we are going to talk about being a former president, and I'm going to talk about former presidents. I don't think I need to explain why we're talking about former presidents today, and thus I won't. But before we plunge into that topic, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game. Last week, I forgot the rules of the game. I'm still kind of living mortified with that fact, but Annie, go ahead and explain the rules of the game.
We kind of thought it was charming last week, but anyway, I do also want to welcome Jessica. We're very excited to have you join us, and we're excited to see many familiar faces in the chat, as well as some old friends who are joining us because they're either on winter break now or weather gave them the opportunity. So thank you for joining us. If you're brand new, we play bingo here. There's a link going around that Carolee can add again. We also are making a map of who comes to our community every Friday. If you want to join in and be on the map, Carolee can help me put that link in again as well. But the main reason we're here is every week Joanne explores interesting topic that's currently either in the news or on all of our minds. And then we spend about a half hour where she fleshes that out and describes it. We all take notes. Many of us have several notebooks now after about a little over 2 years now, I think. But if you have a burning question, if you just really want Joanne to address, it has to go in the Q&A, because the chat, as some of you have already seen, flies by so fast. There's no way we can keep track of them. So we really, really want you to put all of your burning questions in the Q&A, and then we'll open that up a little bit later.
Wonderful. And I will also say, which I probably also forgot last week when I forgot everything, is that if you are new, if you are a first-time person attending here at History Matters, please tell us, because the History Matters community is an amazing community, and you will be welcomed, roundly welcomed into the community. And so just let us know in chat there. And I can't read chat because I get too distracted while I'm talking, so I won't see you initially, but later I'll find out that you're new. So, okay. Okay, I was just going to ask that question. Episode 141. That's kind of cosmic. Okay. So I think I called it ex-presidents and rather than former presidents. And there's no, Donna says cosmic. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. At any rate, ex-presidents, former presidents, whatever you would like to call them. What I want to talk about is what happens when presidents stop being presidents, whether they'd like to or not, when they're done with their presidency. And as I suggested, I think in whatever social media note I sent out into the world about it, we've had a number of different kinds of former presidents. I want to talk about that a little bit today. I'm going to talk about a few, partly founding presidents, because they kind of usefully for us modeled some of the different things one might do as a former president, but not only founding presidents. I want to talk a little bit about what people chose to do, what these people chose to do. And then I want to talk a little bit about the implications of it for the presidency, generally for that position, for the kind of person who tends to run for president and what that suggests. But I want to start with individual people. And as you'll see, in one way or another, very often, we're going to be talking in one way or another about public service, about public political service. You will get a sense in a very short amount of time of many of these people being people with a sense of purpose, also being people with a legacy that, you know, when you step down, and we do that all the time in some ways too, don't we? When there's a crisis, and sometimes we will think to ourselves, why don't all the former presidents get together and say something or do something? Because they retain a degree of authority after they're done being presidents. It's a very small club of people who are alive who have been former presidents. And those are people who have been given an enormous honor and who have been, whether we have liked them as leaders or not, have been leaders of this country. So they are, as former presidents, in an interesting position to sometimes be able to choose what they would like to do with their lives after the presidency, particularly when some of them are relatively young when they stop being president. But so let's talk a little, and actually, not surprisingly at all, given that it's me speaking this morning, let's go all the way back. Let's talk about some founding presidents to begin with, and then we'll move forward in time a little bit. And even if you look at, and in some of these cases, I think there are going to be things I'm talking about here that probably people don't know that these former presidents took part in part because they're not the things that they were best known for. We don't actually normally really, unless you're Jimmy Carter, which I'll come to shortly, focus a lot on what former presidents do. In the case of George Washington, he really wanted to be retired before he was president. Right? So he wasn't excited about staying in public office. He did for one term. He was persuaded to stay for a second term, partly by Thomas Jefferson, who then promptly went and resigned his office and went home, which left Washington really grouchy. When he finally, Washington, left office and went back to Mount Vernon, not that long after that, the United States became involved in what became known as the Quasi-War with France, the not quite fully declared a war with France. And of course, who did the nation turn to be the supreme commander in chief of the army at that moment to really oversee the quasi-war effort? George Washington. Now, what's interesting about this is you would think, and I would think, that given all of the for many, many years, the ways in which he's saying, I'm so tired, I don't want to do this anymore, why can't I go home, over and over and over again, that the quasi-war coming along, that there would be angry, crotchety George Washington letters. But in fact, when you read his correspondence, he was kind of waiting to be asked. There are some letters in which he's like, yeah, okay, it's a quasi-war. Why are people not turning to me? So he actually was in some way, in a Washingtonian kind of way, eager to be able to step forward and take part and offer his guidance. He did not ever assume, nor did anyone else, that at his advanced age, he was going to go plunging out onto the battlefield. But it was assumed, and he certainly wanted to oversee the effort. The question of who was second in command became a big deal. I won't go into great detail, but suffice it to say that Alexander Hamilton kind of shoved his way in there and made a lot of people angry in the process. But the point of this is that the nation turned to him in some ways, and equally significant for what we're going to be talking about this morning, he was very ready and almost eager, really, to step forward at this moment when he, of course, was the person most qualified to step forward at a time of war with the United States, given where the United States came from and his role in leading the army. So Washington, clearly, given his eagerness, had that kind of sense of both public responsibility and also his own sense of purpose his personal sense of purpose was wrapped up in his sense of office. All of that you can kind of see bundled together in his attitude towards jumping into play during the Quasi-War. Now, John Adams, it's hard, I always could talk about John Adams as being the Rodney Dangerfield of the founding because, I don't get no respect. It somehow needs to be like the bubble above John Adams's head in some way, because he almost literally says that many times, right? Like no one ever looks to John Adams. Boy, the scenery of the business, the theater of the business goes to Jefferson, right? It doesn't go to John Adams. And being second after George Washington, that's a tough for anyone, not even just John Adams. That would be tough to come in after that performance by the ultimate national leader. Interestingly, so we know for a fact, and I'll come momentarily to Jefferson, we know that part of what Adams and Jefferson did in retirement was have a wonderful correspondence with each other, which I know I've recommended before. It's truly wonderful to read because they're reflecting back on the revolution, on their presidencies, on their thoughts about the nation. Adams with a sense of humor, Jefferson largely without a sense of humor, which is pretty typical for both of them, but very much worth reading. All of that, you can find it through the Founders Online database through the National Archives. You'd have to, look for from or to Adams and Jefferson. There's also an edited volume of their correspondence. It's old by this point, but handily collected together by Lester Cappon, Cappon. And I think it's called it's either the Adams-Jefferson correspondence. I think it's the Adams-Jefferson correspondence. I think Adams comes first. At any rate, very much worth reading. But the other thing that Adams interestingly does for part of his retirement is he defends himself, his actions as president. He writes a long series of newspaper editorials for the Boston Patriot newspaper because this goes to the Quasi-War. In the end, although his party, the Federalists, were eager for him to take this opportunity to essentially do something warlike against France, which is the nation that the Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, prefer, Adams instead sends a peace mission, sends a negotiation troop over to France, and they negotiate peace. Federalists were really, really, really not happy about that. It did not seem to be friendly to the Federalist Party. John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, who I will also come to shortly, were the two one-term presidents in this early period, the only two. And they are one-termers because they did what one would think a president is supposed to do, which is act independently in thought and not simply follow along party lines, which is not to say that every other president was just blindly following party lines, but both of these men did what they wanted regardless of what their party wanted. And for Adams, sending a peace mission to France to settle the Quasi-War was the prime example of this. And he was denounced for it. He was attacked for it in a variety of different ways. So in his retirement, he spends years writing this series of editorials defending that decision. Really interesting. I write about it briefly in my first book, I think in the epilogue of my first book, Affairs of Honor, but totally worth looking at because he's being John Adams, right? He's defensive and he's a little bit angry and he's proud of himself, and he's, says things like, this is the thing for my presidency that I am the proudest of anything I did, because of course he would say that. He probably is proud of it, but also people are attacking him for it. So it is the best. But he stood independent and did it. But so he spent a chunk of his retirement, at least a few years, defending what he did during his presidency. Interesting. And again, talks about how in some way the personal and the political and the public and the private, and this is true for many political figures and public figures, but particularly for presidents who serve in a job that on the one hand is unquestionably political and in the mix of the ongoing hard politics world, but on the other hand, their symbolic presence, their personal presence matters enormously too. So it's a job that perhaps more than many others in politics totally engages their identity and their reputation in their public persona in a way that it's probably hard to walk away from or detach from after you leave office. So that's John Adams. Now, Thomas Jefferson, I wrote, I'll tell you what I initially wrote down, and then I paused for a minute and I revised what I said. I'm only going to read it because compared with what I wrote down after this initial quick sentence, it made me laugh. Okay, so I wrote here from my notes to myself, George Washington, actually GW quasi-war, JA defending himself in Boston Patriot, TJ refusing to act on slavery and organizing his papers. That was my initial thought. But of course, then I paused for a moment and I said, no, actually, University of Virginia, Freeman, that's where you got your PhD. So one of the main occupations of his retirement years was what ultimately became a kind of pet project, which was creating the University of Virginia. He designed the campus buildings, he set up its curriculum, he selected the faculty, he was hyper involved in the creation of the University of Virginia. So, you know, that actually, shame on you, Joanne, for just reducing him to refusing to act on slavery and organizing his papers. He did organize his papers, I'm going to come back to that, but major project of his retirement was creating an institution of higher learning for the South. And he is doing this as a Southerner for the South. At this point, most of the colleges and universities are Northern. There's William and Mary in the South, but he actually wanted the University of Virginia, I suppose by Jeffersonian terms at the time, to be something more, what do I want to call it? Stringent and disciplined and sweeping and whatever it was that he wanted. UVA, that was going to be the place that accomplished that. So at any rate, there you can see, again, public-mindedness, in this case, Southern public-mindedness, but still, he has a purpose and he really devoted himself to it. When I dug around a little to remind myself what else he did in retirement, I'm just going to offer this because it's Thomas Jefferson. The other things, some of the other things he did in his retirement would be reading Plato's Republic in the original Greek. Oh, and being elected president of the American Philosophical Society until 1815. So Jefferson was very much being Jefferson. But again, you can see that he did ultimately really dedicate a lot of his time and energy to something public-minded, Southern public-minded. James Madison, again, so I have Jefferson refusing to act on slavery and organizing his papers. And then I have James Madison explaining Constitution, which he did do a lot. There's a book by Drew McCoy, and I always get wrong, whether it's Last of the Founders or Last of the Fathers, whatever it is, it's one of the two, talks about James Madison in retirement. And what he did, and what part of what that book explains in a really interesting way, which is where explaining Constitution came from. Not surprisingly, and the same thing happens to Jefferson and actually to Adams concerning the Declaration of Independence. People, when these men are in retirement, total strangers, write to them and say, you know, what did you mean by, and why did you do this, and how do you interpret this as it corresponds with the Constitution? So, I mean, imagine, you know, you are engaged in the world of politics and the people who created the Constitution are still alive and watching. Now, of course, you're going to write to them and in one way or another ask questions like, what did you mean? Did you mean this? What do you think of this thing that we're doing now? Is that, you know, never mind originalism. What do they intend? Just ask them. And sometimes they tell you. And indeed, you know, Madison did spend time writing to strangers, not necessarily about original intentions, but about the creation of the Constitution, and more significantly, I think, to Madison, about current politics, ongoing politics, and what he thought about them. He and James Monroe actually go on to serve on the Board of Visitors at UVA, and of course, not surprisingly, they both become involved in it. But Madison, in addition to talking to people about the direction the nation is going and had gone, he ends up being a delegate at the Virginia Constitutional Convention, again, being in a position of negotiating. When there's a big national debate about the ever exciting tariffs. I'm sorry, but I don't get excited about tariffs, but boy, did they get excited about tariffs in this time period. Madison stepped forward and had something to say about it, 1828. He talked out actually against nullification in these later years. He was a founding member of the American Colonization Society, which favored a gradual abolition of slavery and the resettlement of formerly enslaved people and free Black Americans in Africa. So we can think a variety of different things about the kinds of things Madison was involved in. But again, in one way or another, he continues on full-fledged, working on these public-minded projects in line with his personal opinions in his Madisonian way, because he's kind of this quiet guy who doesn't necessarily want to take up the limelight. And that's kind of what he does truly in character. Now, to me, one of the most interesting ex-presidents is John Quincy Adams, who in many ways is better as an ex-president than he was as a president. His presidency was not horrific. It just was not particularly stellar in some ways. But after his presidency, he then goes on and runs for Congress at the urging of neighbors in Massachusetts. And supposedly he set two conditions for running for Congress after his presidency: that he would never ask for votes, he would never solicit votes, and he would always follow his conscience. He was not going to be guided by party, he was not going to be guided by anything, which pretty much is what he wanted to do as president too. So, really interestingly, he stops being president and he is an ex-president, son of a founding father, elderly by this point, and he is elected into the House after his presidency and serves 9 post-presidential terms in Congress from 1830 until his death in 1848, which in and of itself is admirable. And if you're curious about this at all, the blood looming over my shoulder here, the field of blood, there's a whole chapter on Adams's congressional career, which is really fascinating because he totally took advantage of the fact that he was a former president, an elderly man, and the son of a founder. And what that meant was he could say and do whatever he wanted, and no one could physically hurt him. And he knew it. And so he spent a lot of time saying by his conscience what he felt needed to be said, and then essentially saying, come and get me, because you can't. So he used his ex-president status to benefit his message. He often was speaking and fighting for the minority. He was anti-slavery and particularly worked hard against what became known as the gag rule, which tabled petitions, debate on any petition that had anything to do with slavery. He kept trying to have petitions read into the record. He would try tricks, and he, of course, was a parliamentary expert beyond experts. So he deployed every trick he could find to force the discussion of slavery on the floor and force himself to the center of it so that he could take advantage of that spotlight to speak out on this cause that he felt strongly about. And ultimately, not only because of him, but he sure had a large part to do with the repeal of the gag rule in 1844. He also, in 1841, successfully argued before the Supreme Court to win freedom for enslaved mutineers that had been aboard the Spanish ship Amistad. That's an ex-president, man. That's an ex-president, 9 terms in Congress, and argues before the Supreme Court, and does it all clearly not, basking in the limelight. Oh, yes, I'm John Quincy Adams. Look at what I'll do now. But really acting for purposes and doing things that he felt committed to as purposes, as causes, involved in one way or another in the fight against slavery. So he was fascinating to study in Congress, specifically because as a former president, that put him in his own category in Congress. But there is someone with a real sense of mission who continues on with that. And he has a stroke and on the floor, in the saddle, so to speak. He, till the very end, is working hard at this sense of public purpose. I won't go into great detail about others. I will say, someone like Andrew Jackson, I just because he's so well known, you wonder, and so kind of flamboyant a president, what did he do? He remains, not unlike others here, influential in national politics. He has a lot to say about the annexation of Texas. He helps to persuade James Polk, to run for president. Any ex-president is influential, can be influential in politics to come. The question is, how do they choose to exercise that? Tyler, in 1860, after his presidency, tried desperately to avoid that conflict by trying to chair some kind of a peace convention between Northern and Southern state representatives. That did not necessarily go very well. And ultimately he becomes a leading proponent of Southern secession. So much for that attempt, but he did try. In a way, for those of us around today, the most famous ex-president is Jimmy Carter, right? Who is like kind of in a John Quincy Adams kind of sense, clearly not trying to be in the limelight, but just committed to a variety of different humanitarian causes, Habitat for Humanity being the one that he really steps forward for and has been working for. We all have, I'm sure, in our head images of him working on building homes. He's also at times been a kind of freelance ambassador. He's been writing books. The unifying message here for most of these people that I've been talking about is they have a sense of clearly of public purpose. Also, just as clearly for many of them, their personal identity, their reputation, their sense of purpose themselves is bound up with politics and in some ways with the fact that they were president. And that feeds into whatever leads to what they're doing after their presidency. But it's an interesting phenomenon to consider because it's a reminder of the fact that certainly not by any means all presidents, but a good many presidents are driven to run for president and be president because they have a sense of public purpose. We may not agree necessarily with that sense of public purpose, but that's what drives them. And the truest way in which you can see the validity of that and the depth of that and the meaning of that is looking to see what they do in their retirement when they don't necessarily have to be engaged in those kinds of projects at all. And yet they do, and they are, and they have been, because it matters to them. It is part of what has always been driving them. Now, of course, there are also presidents who retire and don't go on to work in big public projects of one kind. There are presidents who just go off into retirement and people visit them quietly. Actually, people liked to visit, particularly the Southern founder presidents, these poor men. The Southern gentleman on his plantation had to display a certain kind of hospitality to visitors, which meant that basically anyone could show up at a Southern plantation and expect hospitality of a certain sort. And so you had people like Washington and certainly Jefferson escaping so that they didn't have to hang out in their own homes while people came and, peered in the windows and appeared looking for hospitality. That couldn't have been particularly fun. That's the joy of being a Southern plantation owner. You got a plantation, you're a Southerner. Okay. I hate to say it this way, pay the price. But regardless of all of that, a lot of these people either go quietly off or they have a sense of public purpose. Presidents who don't display either one of those things, who don't seem to have a sense of public purpose, but rather appear to be driven by ego and little else, I would say, generally speaking, the ego component is not necessarily absent in many former presidents, but they don't put it first and foremost. They don't necessarily have that as their main calling card. so to speak. I'm sorry, I'm trying really hard. The fact of the matter is, once you've been president, you have a sense of the responsibilities of the job, and you have a sense of what's entailed and a sense of the many ways in which the nation runs and is strong and is vulnerable, and the ways in which your life have been intertwined with that. Most people are affected by that, and it shapes what they do after their presidency. I will only say, since I'm trying desperately and unsuccessfully to not be political, as we so often try not to be here at History Matters, a former president who appears to have no larger sense of public purpose other than himself, that deserves to be seriously questioned, because it leads you to ask the obvious question, answer it in your own ways. What drove that person to want to be president in the first place? Which isn't to say that anyone who runs for office and wants to be president isn't partly driven by fame, power, prestige, all of the things that you get when you're president. The question is, what else is there besides that? And often, I go off and look and see what past presidents do that I haven't spoken about. You'll see that in what they do once they step down. And as a matter of fact, a very easy way to do this is the Miller Center at the University of Virginia has, someone will be able to find this because you are the fastest people at finding things online. They have a catalog of all the presidents, and you can see what they did during their lives, and they all have a category after the presidency. So you can actually go and see what every past president did after the presidency. It's the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, and I cannot remember what the database is called, but someone there I know will find it. At any rate, I will stop my comments there. The sort of bringing it back to today component is always think about what drives a president, and look for it in part in what they do when they step down. I was like, okay, at this point, I'm already like prepared to do the mug. I've already just took off the wonderful mug cover, but I had to actually look and wait for someone to say mug, mug, mug before I picked it up. This is where you guys have me. This is kind of an obvious contender, but it's George Washington. It's not only that, it's the presidency of the United States, right?
Fancy.
From Mount Vernon, which is, I believe, where I bought this. So at any rate, I looked and went into my mug cabinet, which is way smaller than you guys must imagine it is. And that was the very obvious contender. I feel bad now because I don't have like new mugs to surprise you with. But at least I'm on target, right? I'm finding appropriate mugs.
Maybe Santa or Hanukkah will bring you a new mug.
Maybe
Never know.
newbie. You can
Newbie
you're
might
his bird.
Bring
You
you stocking.
you never know.
You can make little tiny mugs for newbie. Okay, we've got lots of questions. So are you ready to jump in? Do you need to take a sip of coffee first? Or are we ready to go?
Yes, no, I'm gonna take a sip of coffee, but go ahead with the first one.
Okay. So this first one comes from our friend Julia, who is back with us after being gone for a while. And so I just want to personally say, Julia, we welcome you back. We missed you. Julia lost her mom recently, Joanne, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
caregiver. And we're just so happy to have her back. And she said the reason she fell in love with history is because of her mom. So I feel like our gathering today is our way of honoring Julia's mom. So this is for you and your mom, Julia, sweet Julia. It says, Joanne, can you talk about information about the presidents once they became former, in thinking about this in light of the release of the JFK files yesterday, which so much was redacted? As private citizens, what are ex-presidents owed, and how do we balance this with the public's right and need for historical record? That's a great question.
Wow, look at that.
Coming in hot.
I know, really. Well, okay, so now this is an interesting question, right? Because on the one hand, the president is a public servant put in office by us in one way or another. We can define us however we choose to, but the American people put presidents in office. They are acting on our behalf, and we, the nation, deserves access to their papers. Presidential libraries, are partly grounded on that responsibility, in addition with the fact that they also take on the persona and purpose of the particular president whose library it is. So it's interesting to visit presidential libraries for that reason. That said, the larger question of what the public should have access to or what the public cannot have access to and what needs to be redacted or not, what should be confidential, what should remain confidential, what shouldn't remain confidential. These are obviously huge issues which have certainly been in the news in the United States for in recent months. It's a good question, and there isn't an absolute answer for that. I mean, I think as is often the case, speaking as a historian, when you're doing research and you're trying to get a hold of things and you see what is available and you see what isn't available, the reasons why things aren't available are sometimes so quirky or so personal or so happenstance in some way or another. And yet that entirely shapes the historical record and how we understand the past. There's not an easy answer to that question, but it's a vital question to consider. It's why you can request, redacted information. It's why there are ways in which you can try and find out things that perhaps aren't initially in the public record, although that takes time and effort. It's an excellent question because in one way or another, what we do or don't have access to is what we do or don't understand and know about our history. And we find all the time in the United States and in other countries as well, we hear about or learn about things and we think, gasp, really? I can't even think of a specific example, but there have been any number of businesses, for example, that are like, yeah, actually they appeased or were working with the Nazis in some way, right? And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Now I have to work that into my understanding of this brand and how I feel about this brand or whatever. We can't fully understand the past without the data that constructs it. And there are reasons why not all of that data is available, but there are not solid. There are a lot of fast ways of figuring this out that have to do with the moment. Solid rules, certainly in the realm of historical research, hard sometimes to find. And you end up having to reconstruct paths and figure out why things are or aren't there and you end up spending a lot of time trying to decide what silence means. Never mind even knowing what's been redacted, but just the absence of something. You have to think about, and this is particularly true if you're writing about people who are not, particularly in this early period, white men or white men of means, right? Their voices are going to be less present or sometimes not present at all. Archives are silent in some ways. It doesn't mean these people weren't there. It means that no one thought whatever they happened to have around them was worthy of saving, or there were no people at the time who stepped forward to save the voices of these people. That again, silences can speak volumes. So all of this is, Tom, that's a question. All of this is pardon?
He was told to save it for the after party.
Yeah, very much so. But at any rate, I'm going on. The point of this is there's not one solid rule. And I'd say that that's basically always the case as a historian, is that you're always dealing with the happenstance of actual living life. And in the case of former presidents, the problem with that is just what they have done shapes who we are as a country. And so the implications of that are pretty huge.
Yeah. Francesca had an interesting one. This one caught my attention. She says that in the UK, they now have 3 former prime ministers serving in the House of Commons, May, Truss, and Johnson. She wanted to know, did any former presidents ever go back into Congress as a senator or representative that you can recall?
Well, that was John Quincy Adams, right? John Quincy Adams went back to the House and served 9 terms. Oh. But that was unusual. Which is where that question comes from, right? That's kind of shocking because we don't expect that to happen. And that gave him, as I mentioned, a kind of a special status, right? Because he could be like, well, I'm a former president, I think. So there's a power to that. But the fact of the matter is kind of what's underlying the question there is, in a sense, the presidency is as high as you can get in a position. And so it takes an interesting person, particularly, to step away from that and then go into what many would conceive of as a lower position, to being in Congress. But again, there has to be some sense of public purpose in addition to, perhaps, I'm not going to speak on behalf of who now is serving in Parliament, but there are also people who just are looking for a purpose, who want to promote themselves, who like being in the public light, who, there are any number of reasons why people above and beyond the sense of public purpose might push themselves after their presidency to do things. But I suppose the ultimate message of what I was saying this morning is it's always worth looking to detect if there is any sense of public purpose that a former president is showing, and what that suggests, not only about what they're doing after the presidency, but what they did during their presidency too.
All right, so Dave asks what your thoughts are. There's been some talk about replacing President's Day as a national holiday with something around an election day off for people to be able to go and vote.
Oh,
you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I guess I have a couple of thoughts. Should there be a day off when people can vote? Yeah, there sure should. Do we need to replace a holiday to get that? I don't know. I don't have strong feelings one way or another about President's Day. I do have very strong feelings about the fact that there should be a day off so that people, no matter what their job is, have the opportunity to vote. So I guess that's how I'll answer that question is, yeah, there should be that. And I feel strongly about that. And they're whatever the reasons are, which probably are economic as to why we don't have that, are not, they're not even in the balance with the fact that everybody should be able to, excuse me, readily vote without risking their job in any way.
We saw that a lot as teachers, parents that couldn't come in for conferences, much less go vote, especially when the lines are long in certain areas. You can't take 4 hours off to vote.
Well, particularly, right, that now lines get longer because people are trying to make it somewhat harder to vote. And many people, for very understandable reasons, have a job they can't stand online for, or families or responsibilities they can't stand online for 4 hours, which is, again, part of the reason for some of the actions that we've seen.
And another reason for early voting not to be thwarted. Okay, so Dale was asking about the ex-president's wives, particularly Martha and Abigail, given the influence and activities they engaged in while their husbands were in the White House. What about the obligations or the lives of the president's wives after their term is over?
Right. I don't know why. Hang on a sec. Suddenly.
No, I'm not the same thing. I think it's just the
Really?
Yes.
Okay. In the case of Martha Washington, she wasn't really excited about being first lady at all. So I think she was really happy to be a former first lady. That just, she was kind of dragged back into some kind of public life on behalf of her husband. I think a person, a wife of a president who actually was in some ways really an active politician that would be worth thinking about in this way, at least in the early period, is Dolly Madison, who very aggressively was shaping the image and the nature of the presidency, and in the course of doing that, the nature and image of the nation writ large in a cultural kind of a way. The fact of the matter, though, is, wives of presidents, in a way, many of them have gone on to do what women traditionally have done, to have a public impact of some kind, to have to involve themselves in the larger world when they have been pushed away from the realm of politics. And that is working social reform, working in reform movements. There's a reason why a lot of those causes in the first half of the 19th century have such a strong component of women out there working for reform and change. Those kinds of causes, although they were definitely public and had immense responsibilities and potentially an immense impact, they were seen as not political in some way, and so they were acceptable for women. So in some way, when we're talking about the wives of president going back in the past, we are still looking at a population of people that had limits set on what they could or couldn't do, fewer limits than if they had been an average woman or even an average elite woman in American society. But again, I mean, come on, as I'm sitting here trying to think about how women were restricted in what they could do, we still had people talking about Hillary Clinton and baking cookies. Remember that? Okay, so what the wives of presidents do and what they should be doing and who they should be and whether they should be politicians and have a public presence and have public program ambitions of their own, we're still there were still people smacking at that when Clinton was president. So that's a large, seemingly should be a non-issue, but that's an issue that still goes on. It'll just be fascinating to see what happens when we finally do get a woman as president. You know, it's going to be different, right? The first man or whatever it is that they decide to call the partner of the first female president suddenly won't have those kinds of restrictions being put on him. But anyway, that will be interesting to see.
I think the second gentleman, is that what they're calling?
That's right. I just saw Julia says first
Second
gentleman.
gentleman. So I think he's kind of starting to start some traditions sort of in a way in the back end of things, but
Which is good. First gentleman. Yes.
I like it. Okay. Tom was asking, who was the first president that they applied the term elder statesman to? Do you-
Wow. I don't even know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, you know, John Quincy Adams was old man eloquent, but that isn't quite elder statesman. I don't know that. It's always funny. Like, I believe that the term founding fathers comes about in the 20th century. I think it's Warren G. Harding who comes up with founding fathers. My good friend Richard Bernstein, who publishes as R.B. Bernstein, in a book called The Founding Fathers Reconsidered, I think he talks about that in there, which again, there's something that you somehow think should have a much longer life than it has. So, but I don't know the specific answer to that question.
And then
Elder
now people are taking off the fathers and just saying founders. So even that's kind of.
Well, yes, which is better.
Yeah.
We don't, you know, that a million years ago, in my early days on Twitter, there was a discussion as to what we call them. And there were people getting very grouchy about the fact that we don't say founding fathers. And they're founders. Why do they have to be fathers? We're right past that now, right? I mean, there are other people besides 8 guys in a room who count as founders or, you know, framers. If you're talking about people who were at the Constitutional Convention, okay, the framers, we don't feel the need to say framer fathers, but at any rate, founders, we should be more inclusive about who we consider to be founders. So I don't see a need to be crotchety about that, but that's just my personal opinion.
Okay, this one comes from our friend Kathleen. She says, when did the current benefits of being a former president come into play in history? Things like lifelong medical care, Secret Service protection, having a library. Was that with the Presidential Former Presidents Act or something that Grover Cleveland started, or she was just curious?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that. It's a really good question, and I would assume it evolves over time. But I don't know the answer to that. And I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't think the early presidents, I mean, you know, who knows? What I was thinking was, you know, Thomas Jefferson died enormously in debt. I don't know what he was getting from the government at that point, if anything. So I don't know when that becomes a thing. Someone out there, I'm sure, has very quick Googling fingers and could determine that. But the pension began with Grant. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, I don't know, but I think it's a later phenomenon. When the office, and so actually along with that, that, you know, these early presidents, it wasn't necessarily seen as a job. It was seen as a sort of public duty. You know, it wasn't like, I shall now take on the job of president. It was, you know, you see very often in letters Jefferson writes to, like, nephews or young men, telling them about the future. And often he'll have in these letters a phrase that says, when you become a public man. So it's just like, if you're of a certain status at that point, it's assumed you're going to go on and serve in public life in some way, have some political position of leadership somehow. So the whole feeling about the presidency is different in that time too.
Yeah. Our friend Gloria has a kind of a follow-up question about the First Lady. She wanted to know, with the recent trend, there are books being written more frequently and films and things about the First Ladies. She wanted to know if you thought it was significant to study the First Ladies to help understand a presidency.
Oh, for sure. Again, a million years ago, I'm now old enough that I can say a million years ago, when I was working on my first book, and I was looking up, there are all of these, the papers of, before they were all online, published editions, papers of Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, whoever. And there was a set, it was like the public papers of Aaron Burr, two volume set. A lot of his papers went down to the bottom of the ocean when his daughter Theodosia went down with a ship, and she took her father's papers with her. But it was the public papers of Aaron Burr. And I remember thinking, it's actually very often the private letters that have the most to tell you about anything. And that's particularly true in politics. I mean, my whole recent book, the absolute best letters for any insight into the culture of Congress, what it felt like to be in Congress, the feelings of members of Congress at any given moment, their personal responses, always letters to wives. Always, or letters from wives to husbands, which makes perfect sense. That's, for most of these people, one of the, if not the closest relationship in their life. There's also a lot of, again, this is the period when probably they all had like good buddy guys who maybe they talked about politics more than with their wives, but in one way or another, letters to wives are hyper wonderful sources of information to learn about politics, specifically because they are not supposedly political letters, they're personal. So people confess, and husbands to wives and wives to husbands confess all kinds of things, particularly when they're not John Adams, although even he did this, or people who knew that they were founders at a certain point. They say all kinds of things in letters to their wives that I over the years, sang hosannas for. Thank you for saying that to your wife. Yay! They confess to being scared. They confess to not understanding what's going on. They confess to what they hate about their office. They confess to what they suspect about the criminal activities of others. They confess all kinds of things to their partner. So to understand a presidency, to understand any public figure or politician, to understand a time period, even if you're interested in the politics of a time period, you have to look at the letters of women related with these public figures, for sure. And sometimes that will be where you will find the least expected, juiciest and most informative information, specifically because these people did not assume they were writing in some way or another about public matters in a public manner.
Yeah. Dave asked who was the last president to write his wife a letter. I guess he's meaning like now they probably text.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
So will we ever be able to get copies of the text messages between the last few presidents? Because they probably aren't. Maybe they are. They could still be writing, but it's like more texting might be interesting to read.
That is true. Well, that I remember when I worked at the Library of Congress, sitting in on a meeting, and I mean, was employed by the Library of Congress, sitting in on a meeting in the manuscript division. And what they were debating was, what do we save now? Right? We're not saving papers necessarily all the time. Like what are we saving? Like the pink pads while you were out, what are we saving as far as the stuff that isn't a formal letter, which is a really good question. So yeah, there are certain kinds of things now, that we have that of course you wouldn't have had in the past, recordings of various kinds, people with their cell phones recording. There are any number of things that we have now that, boy, wouldn't it have been great to have that before, but there are all kinds of things we don't have now that we would have had before. So that, that right there fundamentally shapes what we can and can't know about the past. It's a big, really interesting question. Yeah. I just saw someone say 1776 lyric quotes, yours. That's if you don't know 1776, they sing their letters to each other in some way. And John and Abigail, and they end the song saying yours. So thank you. That is my one line from 1776 song for the morning.
All right, we have one last question. We answered 12 today. That might be a new record. This one comes from Dave. He said, wasn't Grant's plight after his presidency, both financially and physically, and also because Lincoln was killed in office, and is that how we got the Secret Service protection, the most consequential president in terms of how people take care of former presidents? Like, because of Lincoln being assassinated, did everybody from Grant and after that become more benefits and more care?
That I don't know. If the direct impact of Lincoln's assassination was that. I mean, you know, as basically as people's public figures' lives. Oh wow, there you got the whole script. Tim is
We're gonna have a play after this.
wait till the after party, because I could impress you. But at any rate, about 1776. But now I totally forgot what I was talking about.
General Grant or President Grant and
yeah, because over time, the more we move into modern times, the more we actually see former presidents in private life, or know of them in private life, and can see how they're living their lives. And it would be apparent to us if they're living in poverty, or if they're, you know, so in some ways, technology has enabled us to know more than we might have known before about former presidents. I don't say that's a direct reason for why we have presidential pensions and such, but that certainly is going to shape how we see former presidents and then how we treat former presidents.
We cleared the deck.
We cleared the deck. Okay, well, and we are like 1 minute to spare.
So I'm just going to say, we went to the Truman Presidential Library. I don't know if you've ever been to that one. But there was a big teaching conference in Kansas City, and one of the little field trips they do the day before the conference starts was there. And I remember them saying that, and they also take you out to the house that they lived in afterwards. And it was just in a little quiet, tiny neighborhood. It wasn't fancy at all. There were neighbors right next door on either side and across the street. And I was kind of shocked by that, because I grew up in DC area, like Northern Virginia, and there's so much Secret Service and so much red tape. And they said the Secret Service rented the house across the street. And there were 2 agents who were, I think they said, towards the end of their career. So this was kind of like where they sent the oldest agents, because no one was after Bess Truman, right? They had to protect her till she no longer existed. And so they would take
Till she no longer existed.
And one of them would sit on the front porch and drink lemonade with her. And then they take turns guarding her. But I mean, neighbors would walk by and be like, hey, and she'd chat with them. And the Secret Service got to know all the neighbors. And then when she finally died, they said, you know, someone else rented that house. And it was like, somebody else took it over. It was no big deal. And then they turned that into a little mini museum as part of the presidential library. But I always thought she just went back to the neighborhood, right? It wasn't a big deal, right, except for these 2 people that lived across the street that were watching her every move.
Right. Well, that gets back to, I saw at some point sweeping through chat that, you know, we forget that they're just people, which in some ways we do. And that's a great reminder. I will now go back to my life and people will watch me live it.
Well, and like you were saying, so many of the early presidents were in such debt. Like when you go to Montpelier now, Dolly didn't end up in a great way afterwards, because their son, all his gambling. I mean, they tell a pretty rough story of what happened with her. Really sad.
Yeah. There's a photograph of Dolly Madison, which is kind of amazing. You can Google and find it. There's a photograph of the elderly Dolly Madison, just like there are photographs of John Quincy Adams. For me, who has generally worked in a period with no photographs, that was come back to cosmic. The most cosmic aspect of working on this last book was that photographs existed. And for the first time, I could actually see the people I was writing about, which was very strange. It had never happened to me before. But okay, we are 1 minute past, so let me transition us. Okay, so at this point, we are going to segue into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording our conversation so that we can speak in a freer and easier manner. If you have beamed in here through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party momentarily. If you are beaming in through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you will be able to join the after party as well. I want to thank the wonderful History Matters community for being here this morning to engage in the conversation of democracy, as we do once a week, every week, and have for such a long time. I'm so proud of you guys. You're here. Like, this is, I'm goofily proud of the fact that you guys are there and remain a community. I just, all the time, I'm just like, look at this thing we do. But truly, on a more serious note, thank you for being here, particularly in these times. Someone's going to get bingo of extreme contingency when from one minute to the next, we really, at an extreme level, don't know what's coming down the pike and what's going to happen. It's all the more important for us to be here. I knew someone just like bingo. It's all the more important for us to be here, to be engaging in this way, to be able to ask questions, to be able to interrogate what's happening all around us. I want to thank Annie and John for being here as ever and making this all possible, what we do. And I want all of you folks to have a wonderful week during which at some point I will indeed figure out what the next topic of conversation will be. I want to welcome and thank Jessica for being here and beaming in, and welcome her to NCHE and to the History Matters community. It was really, really nice to see you at the outset of our conversation today. And I guess now we will segue to the after party. For those who can't join us, I will see you guys next week.